Hello and welcome. This recorded lecture is all about informative speaking. And first, we really need to begin with what is informative speaking. You can probably assume from the name that the goal is to inform. In fact, that's what the general purpose is to inform. But really what we're doing here is communicating knowledge and understanding from the speaker to the audience. And with that knowledge being conveyed, there's no expectations on the audience for what they do with that information. We're trying to remain as objective and unbiased as possible, just giving information, hoping that it sticks with our audience. And with our content, we want to make sure that what we're saying is accurate, that it's clear, and it's of interest to our audience. So in this recorded lecture, we're going to cover two main things. The first is going over the different types of informative speeches. Then we'll talk about the organizational patterns. So the informative categories, there's three types of informative speech. The first is a demonstration, and we will sometimes call these how-to speeches. And in this type of informative speech, we're taking the audience through a process step by step. So later on, when we talk about organizational patterns, you're likely going to be using only chronological pattern. So going through each of the steps in a sequential order. Some example topics of demonstration informative speeches would be how to tie your shoes or training for a 5K running race. All of those you're going to be explaining to your audience how to do that, how to tie your shoes, how to accurately train for a race. And the next type of informative speech we have is a description speech. And with description speeches, it's in the name. We're describing something, an object, a place, an event, or a person, or a group of people. So with organizational patterns, it depends on your topic and how you approach it. So you can use chronological, spatial, or topical. Some example topics can include the history of ice cream, or maybe the law career of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, one of our Supreme Court justices. And then our last type of informative speech is a definition speech. And so here we're trying to explain a concept or a term that is complex or difficult to understand or unfamiliar to your audience. So again, it depends, but you're likely going to use topical or chronological. So some examples of a definition in informative speech would be the Hindu concept of karma or the impact of the school to prison pipeline. All of those are concepts, right? They're not tangible things, and there's a lot to unpack. There's a lot to uncover about each of these topics. So these are the three informative categories: demonstration, description, and definition. So now that we have a big picture understanding of what are the different types of informative speeches, we can focus in a little bit more thinking about the organizational patterns for informative speeches. And with organizational patterns, what we're really looking at is the structure of your speech, but specifically your main points. So organizational patterns are the different ways that we order and structure our main points in our speech. So there's three main types of organizational patterns for informative speaking. The first is chronological. So with this, we're organizing and orienting in relation to time in some way or another. So for example, if our topic is chairs and the history of chairs, a very unique and novel topic, maybe for main point one, we would want to talk about the origin of chairs and how did they come about. Then at main point two, we want to talk about chairs' growing popularity throughout history. And then we end with main point three, how we view chairs today. So these main points are organized chronologically because you start from the beginning and you go all the way to current day views and practices and trends in chairs and this particular type of furniture. You can also do the opposite, start with where we are today and go back to the origin of chairs. That's also chronological. If you are talking about a person, maybe a movie director, and your main points are 3 of their most influential films. Maybe you want to organize them by running time or by the date that they were released. All of those would be examples of chronological. So it doesn't matter how it's organized and oriented to time, as long as time is the main factor, then it would count as chronological. And so the next organizational pattern we have is called spatial. So if chronological is organizing based on time, spatial is organizing it based on space or location. So let's take a look at our example on the right. So if our topic is microbreweries, main point 1, maybe we want to talk about European style beers, right? Like English pale ales, maybe talk about Guinness. Then in main point 2, we may want to talk about East Coast style of beers, finishing with main point 3, Pacific Northwest style beers and how they tend to be a little hoppier than other places. So here, if you look at a map, we're going from one side of the map to the other as far as the different locations that we're talking about. But assuming that we're giving this speech somewhere in California or anywhere on the West Coast, we're also going from furthest away to closest away. So in 2 different ways, this is using spatial pattern. So again, it doesn't matter how you're organizing based on space or location, as long as location is the basis of it, it counts as spatial pattern. And then our last organizational pattern is topical. And this is organizing based on topics. So this is helpful when your information, your content, your main points, they don't relate to each other based on time or space. So what you do is you just organize them into 3 distinct topics and put them in whatever order makes the most sense to you and your content. So if our topic is Alaskan tourism, maybe with main point 1, we're talking about cruise ships and how before there was a health pandemic, cruise ships would come up to Alaska, particularly in the summers where the weather is a lot more mild. And that brings in a lot of tourism to the state of Alaska. Then main point 2, maybe you want to talk about the fishing and whaling industries and how people come visit Alaska for that as well. And then lastly, maybe you want to talk about all of the nature, the hiking trails, the glaciers you might see. So if we are talking about each of these main points kind of abstractly or in general, so cruise ships in general, fishing in general, glaciers in general, it would be topical. If we talked about specific cruise ship ports, specific glaciers, we could maybe want to think about spatial, but as long as we're keeping it kind of in the general sense, topical would work fine for this topic. And so those are the 3 organizational patterns. We have chronological, spatial, and topical. So lastly, I want to leave you with some helpful hints and guidelines as you go forth and begin to work on your own informative topic. That's going to help you in your research stage of developing your speech, but also it's just going to make sure that your speech is, it makes more sense and it's going to be more clear and more focused than if you were to have a more general speech. So if you're interested in doing something about coffee, that's great, but that's kind of broad. So make it specific, talk about the history of coffee in the US, and that's going to make it much more specific. Remember that you want to remain objective. This doesn't mean that we can't talk about controversial events or people, but you want to remain neutral. Or if you try to, or if information you have rather is more one side or the other, make sure that you include information about the opposite side so that way it remains balanced. And lastly, this can be tricky, but we want to veer away from persuasion. Informative and persuasive speeches, they often overlap because information sometimes can be persuasive in how it's framed and who says it and how they say it. And persuasive speeches need information in order to make their points and to strengthen their arguments. But in order to keep it in the informative realm, you want to be honest with your biases, and you want to make sure that you're not trying to convince your audience to do anything, to come on one side of an issue or another. You're just presenting information And the goal ultimately is that your audience walks away from your speech knowing more about your topic than they knew when it began. And if you can do that, you will have a successful, informative speech. So thank you for listening. I hope this was helpful, and I look forward to hearing your informative speeches later on.